What do you do when you score a great deal on 20 pounds of ground beef? Well, you put it up and add it to your food storage. Hi, I'm Jara with Wicked Prepared. Here at Wicked Prepared, we're all about prepping, gardening, and just all-around self-sufficiency. If those topics are interesting to you, go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future uploads. We all know grocery prices are on the rise, and meat has always been expensive. It's always taken a bigger bite out of the budget than most other items. I usually have a top price, like a max price I want to pay, and for ground meats that's about $3 a pound. For boneless, skinless chicken breasts, I do not want to pay over $1.99 a pound, things like that. And I try to find it as much under that price as I can. So that means I look for big, really good sales at our local grocery stores, and I also look for the clearance stickers that they put down on the meats when they're getting close to their expiration date. And lately that's been harder to come by. There haven't been any really good sales. I haven't found much marked down. It's been really hard to come by a good deal. So I was extremely excited when I found 2 of these 10-pound logs of ground beef at my local Walmart, and they are marked down to $22.92, which makes it about $2.29, $2.30 a pound. I found 2 of them, and I was so excited I wanted to cry happy tears. So I grabbed them both and brought them home. I know a lot of people balk at buying meat in these plastic tubes, but I gotta tell you, these are really airtight, and they have no air packaged in with the meat. The packaging lays completely flat up against the meat. So I have found that the meat in these plastic tubes actually stays fresh a lot longer. So especially if you're buying them on markdown, that's really important. But I've had packages in these plastic tubes that I've either not gotten a chance to get to, or I forget about them for a few days, and they're, well past their expiration date, and they're still completely fine because they have no air getting in. There's no light getting in. They have no clear window where you can see the meat like some packages do. So don't be afraid of these plastic rolls of meat, honestly. They're really not that bad. And you can get, all different. These are a pretty high fat. These are 73% lean. But you can get them in all different fat contents in these plastic packages. So these are really great. Don't be afraid to give these a try. And in the past, I would usually cook a lot of it up and then freeze it in 1-pound bags. If you scoop about 2.5 cups is about a pound. And I would freeze it in bags like that because it's really, really handy to have already cooked ground beef in your freezer. Means you can just pull out a pack anytime you want to have tacos or spaghetti, chop suey, anything like that. It makes it really easy for the kids to make hamburger helper or anything, if you have to be gone for the evening and they're on their own for dinner. And then I'll sometimes, slice some of these up into 1-pound packages and freeze it uncooked. But I'm really trying to reduce my dependence on my freezer for a couple of reasons. Number one, my freezers are completely packed to the gills. It's just like a game of Jenga, opening that up and trying to pull one thing out without the whole thing toppling down. Anytime you open the door, things are going to come toppling down on you. And I can't really fit much of anything else in the freezers. They're pretty full. So the other reason that I really want to reduce my dependence on the freezers is because I want things that are shelf stable for long term. I want things that I'm not going to have to worry about losing if the power goes out, whether it's just for a few days or a few weeks or an even longer period of time. I want things that are going to stay good on the shelf. They're not dependent upon electricity. They're not dependent upon the grid or anything like that. So I'm going to be canning a good amount of this hamburger. I'm going to cook up at least one of these logs. I'm going to cook up and can probably most. I might put a little bit in the freezer because it is handy to have, a pack in the freezer to pull out, and it does change the texture a little bit when you can meat versus freezing it. But I'm going to cook at least one of these up and can it. So I will take you along as I do that so you can see my process for that. And then I also want to try, I have never canned meatloaf before, and I've been really wanting to try that. And I have a favorite meatloaf recipe that I honestly don't think will work very well for canning, but I'd like to try it. So I'm probably just going to do a small batch and do a few jars. I would typically want to can meatloaf in 1.5 jars, but I'm going to try pint jars so that I don't end up wasting a whole lot if it doesn't come out well. But you're not going to know how things are going to come out until you try it. So I'm going to try probably canning some meatloaf as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cook up one of these rolls of ground beef. And I've got this pan. This is a really nice big pan. I don't even know where I got this. I got it used from someone. And this works perfectly for cooking up these 10-pound rolls of ground beef. So I usually just slit these right open all the way down and just kind of plop them right in there. Okay. Get that on the big burner. And get that going. Now this is just a little tip that I picked up somewhere along the way when you're opening your case of new jars. Well, this one's kind of been through the ringer a little bit. I think my kids got into it, but basically if you just use this, cut around the plastic and leave the plastic on the bottom part of the box. That way you can use the box to store your jars. You know, once you've filled them, you can store them on the shelf in the box. And this plastic being on the bottom part of the box will help make sure that if you have any jar that leaks for any reason, if anything fails or breaks and leaks, it'll help protect anything that's down below on the lower shelves or your floor or whatever may be underneath. So you can just cut off the very top part of the plastic and leave the bottom of the case encased in the plastic. And that'll also help hold the box together so that you can transport it easily. Okay, I'm back and I've got my meat all ground up and all browned up. Now that was a lot of beef, and like I said, it was not the leanest cut of beef, so there was a lot of grease to drain out of that. So I went ahead and drained that just into another big pot in my sink so that I wouldn't be pushing all that fat down my sink. I didn't want to do that. But so I've got my hot meat. My jars are hot. I run them through the dishwasher, which gets them clean and heats them up. So I'm going to be using pint jars today, and I've got wide mouth pints. Now for ground beef, you need 1 inch of headspace, and I have this nifty little headspace measure because you can also use the handle of your debubbler, but I have a really hard time reading those measurements, so this nifty little thing will just fit right down. So actually 1 inch of headspace is quite far down. It's down below the first set of rings. But like I said, we've got our hot meat, hot broth, hot jars. I've got 3 inches of water in my canner that's hot right now, waiting for the jars. Now, I don't have a nice, big, fancy, expensive canner right now. I just have a 16-quart Presto canner. So that's, you know, I do want to add to my canning arsenal, but that, for now, that does the trick. That's what I have for now. So I'm going to get the meat down in there too. I'd like it to stay below the level of the broth when I add the broth. Now what I made for broth is I just used beef better than bouillon. I mixed up just 1 quart of hot broth because I'm not really sure how much I'm going to need. I'd rather run out and make a little more than have extra. But I've got 1 quart of the hot beef broth to ladle into the jars after the meat. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to do broth. I'm not sure how many jars I'm going to get out of this. Now I know that I had 10 pounds of the ground beef, and this should hold just under a pound in each of these pint jars, I think. However, because it was such a fatty cut of meat and I drained off so much liquid, I will probably get less than 10 jars out of this. All right, so that looks good with an inch of head space. Now let's put some broth into this one. I do think I'll be mixing up a little extra broth, probably before we're all said and done here. Okay, that looks good. We're going to go ahead and debubble these jars all around the edge. Just make sure we get up any bubbles. Now, the new lids, they no longer want you to simmer your lids or heat your lids, but before we add the lids, I'm just going to I've got a little dish here with just some white vinegar in it and a little paper towel. And I'm just going to use this to wipe the rims of these jars. That just makes sure that you don't have any, residue from the food on the edge of the jars, to make sure that they're going to seal well. I also checked the jars. These were brand new jars, so I didn't have to check them over too much, but you definitely want to check them over, make sure there's no nicks or chips or any kind of imperfections in the jar, especially in the rim. So just center down the lid and finger tight on the ring. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and put these in the canner, and then I'm going to get the rest of the jars filled up and in the canner, and then I'll bring you back. So now I've got all my jars in the canner. Now I started with 3 inches of water in the canner. It says you can use 2 to 3 inches for my canner, but I wanted to have the higher amount just so I wouldn't have a chance of running the canner dry, less chance of running the canner dry. So I also added a couple splashes of white vinegar into the water. That just helps keep your jars from getting cloudy if you happen to have minerals in your water. So I've got all of my pint jars in the canner, and I've got the lid latched, and the weighted pressure gauge is not on yet, so we're going to bring this up to a boil. I've got it on high heat, and then once it gets started steaming out the top, we're going to let it steam for 10 minutes before we add the gauge. So here you can see that there's a steady stream of steam coming out of the vent on the top, and so now I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes and vent this canner for 10 minutes before we put on the weighted gauge. Now this is the weighted gauge for the top, and because of my altitude I have 10 pounds of pressure on this. You can check your altitude. If you don't know it, you can actually use your smartphone to tell you the altitude or the elevation where you are. So the 10 minutes is just about up, and then we'll be putting this on the canner. Okay, so I have been venting for 10 minutes, and now I'm going to put this on, and we need to get it up to where it's doing a slow, steady rocking. Alright, so she's rocking. I'm going to have to adjust this a little bit because I have kind of a tough time adjusting on this electric stove, but I'm going to go ahead and start the timer. So for meat pints, it's 75 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, so we're just about done with our 75 minutes of processing time. So there we go. So I'm going to turn off the burner, and we are just going to let this come release pressure naturally before we open it up is what we're going to do. Okay, finally this has depressurized and the button has dropped. I'm going to take off the little gauge, and we're going to wait 10 more minutes, and then we should be able to open it up. It's a good thing because I am ready for bed. Okay folks, our 10 minutes are up and it's the moment of truth. It's time to open up the canner and take out our ground beef. I'm going to hold up a jar here, and if you look closely you can see it's actually still bubbling inside. And there's a pop. So I'm going to get the rest of these out, and then I'll finally be able to go to bed. So something that you want to remember when you're getting your jars in and out of the canner is that you always want to lift them straight up and down and not tip them at all, just to help keep the seal. And when you remove them from the canner, when they're all done, the canners come back to pressure, then you wait an extra 10 minutes, then you can open it up and take your jars out, and you want to remove them to a dish towel on your counter, somewhere in a place that you can leave them undisturbed for about 12 to 24 hours while they cool off and seal up. And as they cool, you'll start to hear the little pop of the seals in the lid. And then when they're fully cooled, you could leave the rings on the jars while they're cooling, and when they're fully cooled, you can go ahead and take the rings off, and then you test the seal. Obviously, it should be down. You won't hear it when you push, but the best way to test the seal is just to grab the lid with your fingers and just lift it straight up. And if they're sealed, that lid will hold on tight, and that tells you that they're sealed and they're safe to put on your shelf. Now, a lot of people recommend keeping them on the shelf without the rings. The instructions on my ball jars said that you could do it with or without the rings. I guess people like to leave them without the rings so they can really see if the seal breaks. If the seal fails, you really want to be able to tell. So now that all is said and done, out of my 20 pounds of hamburger, I ended up with 9 pints of hamburger meat right here. And that's all ready to just open up anytime I need it for any soups, casseroles, tacos, spaghetti, anything like that. I ended up with 5 pints of meatloaf, which the meatloaf is an experiment. I'm not really sure because of that recipe. That's our favorite meatloaf recipe for making regular meatloaf, but for canning, it has a sauce that includes ketchup and a whole lot of brown sugar in the sauce. And anytime you put something with a lot of sugar through that high heat, long process of canning that meat requires, it tends to give the sugar like a burnt taste. So that's why I'm a little worried about this. But what I did was, the recipe calls for mixing 1/3 of that sauce with the meat. So I did that. And then when you bake the meatloaf, you're supposed to put 1/3 of the sauce underneath and 1/3 of the sauce over the top of the loaf. So the only sauce that I added to the jar was I made a hole down the middle of the meatloaf with a wooden chopstick. And I've heard that you should do this when you do meatloaf because of how dense it is, to help let the heat penetrate all the way to the center. So then I filled that hole with some of the sauce, just a little bit of that sauce. And then what I did with the rest is I canned it up in these teeny little 4-ounce jelly jars, and that I canned it like barbecue sauce because that's basically what it is. So that's just a 20-minute water bath. So what I'm planning to do is when I open up a jar of meatloaf, I'll open up a jar of the sauce at the same time, and we will add the sauce when we're heating it to serve it. So we'll definitely be trying a jar of this meatloaf here in the next week or so to see how that came out. And besides the meatloaf, I got 7 pints of a beef pot pie filling, which is another sort of experiment that I'm trying. That's also used up some of the frozen mixed vegetables that I have a lot of in my freezer. So that was kind of a double duty thing. I got 3 pints of chicken broth, and this is like a homemade rotisserie chicken broth. That's another thing that I keep an eye out for, markdown stickers. I always go by the deli counter and check out the rotisserie chickens. Because if you can find those marked down cheap enough, it's really great to buy one or a few and take all the meat off and use it for different recipes. I freeze it in packages in the amounts for different recipes that I make often that call for cooked chicken. And then you boil up the bones and make a broth. And I tend to just use the broth by itself. Honestly, for me, chicken broth, homemade chicken broth is like the best medicine. If I feel like I'm getting sick, getting sniffly, I just heat up some homemade chicken broth. I put in a little bit of salt, pepper, and turmeric, and I feel like that just keeps me from getting sick every time. So I had just made some broth. It was in the fridge, so I just heated it back up and canned it. And because I really needed some place fillers. I wanted to fill my canner so that I like to keep the canner full. So I have less chance of jars tipping over and all that. So I did up 3 pints of chicken broth to fill the space in my last canner load. And then I did 1 pint of burrito in a jar. This is another sort of experiment that I'm trying out. So for this, I just put in just a little bit of raw pinto beans in the bottom, raw brown rice, pepper, onion, taco seasoning, some of that cooked Hamburg, some Rotel tomatoes over the top, and then filled it to the 1-inch headspace with hot broth. And I actually had just exactly enough of that chicken broth left over that's what I used in that jar. So it completely took care of that chicken broth. That went in for the 75 minutes meat time for a pint, and the beans and the rice cooked right in the jar. And it looks amazing. So we're going to try that one out soon too, because if that comes out well, I'll be making a lot more of those. That was pretty cool. So, and in addition to all the pints that I got, I did end up with 4 pounds of the cooked Hamburg for the freezer. I just packaged it up really thin. This one's actually been in the freezer. I just took it out to show you, so it's kind of warped. But I just packaged them real flat, and they don't take up a lot of space in the freezer. They're handy to have to pull right out anytime you need a pound of cooked Hamburg. The only thing I forgot to do was to leave any of this ground beef in a raw state, in an uncooked state, in case I wanted to make meatballs or meatloaf or anything like that. But that's okay, because I'm sure I have some already in my freezer, and hopefully I'll find another good deal on ground beef pretty soon. So I am by no means an expert on canning. I just wanted to bring you along and show you what I did with this Hamburg and how I put this up, how I canned it, what I was going to try. So if you've ever canned a Hamburg or any recipes with Hamburg, I would love to know how you did it, what you did, what your experience has been, especially if you've ever canned meatloaf. I'm really looking for some good recipes and tips for that, because like I said, I don't know how this one is going to turn out. So I am definitely not an expert, just showing you what I did. If you're new to canning, there's a couple places that you can start. I would recommend, number one, the manual for your particular canner is a great place to start. The Ball Blue Book. This is another great resource. I got this particular copy from Rob's auntie, which is very special. And you also can check the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They have a website with all sorts of information, so much information. That's a really great place to look also. Yeah, don't be afraid to learn how to can, or if you already know how to can, keep at it, because it's very, very important. It's a very important skill to have. It's really making a comeback, I feel, and it's for good reason. I'm Jara with Wicked Prepared. Survive today, thrive tomorrow. We'll see you next time.